budgeting. It's the last session of the day, so we can stay here as long as you want or as short as you want. And the purpose of this session is, as you know, for the upperclassmen, there's been changes in the way money's going to be appropriated and member projects are treated. I don't think there's any, Representative Fisher is the only freshman, right? The way money's going to be spent and money's going to be appropriated. So the purpose of this is, we're creatures of habit. So a lot of us are set in our ways thinking we've historically done things a certain way and we want to continue to do them that way. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. So in order for you to be considered in the appropriations process, it's going to be treated like any other project or any other bill. So you file your bills, you own your bills, you work your bills, you pass your bills, and they ultimately become laws. Appropriations will be no different. So in order for you to be considered for the appropriations process for any bill, any member bill, you have to file a bill. And it's that simple. And Joanne Lesnoff, most of you know, will be explaining the process in which that takes place. And even before we get to that, as you know, I know most of you read the state outcomes and the outlooks. We have about a $7 million surplus going into next year. In an $83.5, $84 billion, it's an accounting error. You really don't see that money. So as you consider and as you circulate and as you think about your member projects and as you think about your personal priorities, take into account that. Coming up with a $50 or $100 or $200 million ask in a year in which we have no money might be a little bit unrealistic. Even if you come with a great project, know that that money has to come from somewhere else. We don't create money and we don't borrow money, except for PICO. So if we want to fund your project, it has to come from another part of the budget. So just keep that in mind. And as you're preparing your projects, you're gonna have to attach your name to them, and you're gonna have to present them. So just really be cautious and judicious in which projects you decide to champion. Because at the end of the day, if the project's a great success or a roaring failure, your name's gonna be attached. And you don't wanna be in a position in which you championed a great cause with a great name, in which the CEO later runs into some sort of legal issue, and their state's trying to claw back money, and the person was compensated hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you had no idea, and it's your name and it's your reputation that'll follow that project. So really take the time to analyze and to vet, and to ask those difficult questions of any organization that would like to receive state money, because ultimately your colleagues will ask those of you. Without any further ado, Joanne Lesnoff.
Thank you, sir. And thank you. The chairman took some time to explain the premise of our new rule, and there'll be another session on that tomorrow. We're trying to get as much information out about the new rule as possible, because it is a big sea change on how we're going to do business in the Florida House related to appropriations projects. On this course here, we're looking to take a view of how our budgeting process works at a little deeper level than our course was this morning, and kind of step back from the legislative process at first and realize that our budgeting process is a year-long, very dynamic process, and it's circular, and I call it the circle of life because it is the circle of my life. So I'm going to go over a few things. I encourage participation because I know it's late and folks are tired and maybe a little cold, and the talking might warm the room up. And I have candy for participants and non-participants too. Smarties, because all the members are very smart. When I train the aides, we have Smarties for good questions and dum-dums for other questions. Today we have Smarties. We can start anywhere on the circle of life, but I like to start with the legislature because I'm legislature-centric. Just very quickly, as you all know, the budget in the legislative process operates a little differently. Unlike other bills, although it goes through both chambers, there is a special rule regarding amendment deadline, so I would remind you of those, to watch for that special rule. There are an allocation process, since subcommittees cannot spend all the general revenue. There's an allocation for the House before the House passes its budget, and a joint allocation before the budget goes to conference. So just remember, during the legislative process, it moves a little differently from other bills. The bill has to be on the desk. Didn't care for that phone. The bill has to be on the desk 72 hours before, thank you, Chairman, 72 hours before sine die, and that's a constitutional requirement. It's sort of referred to as the cooling off period. After the legislature passes its GAA, the governor has 15 days, assuming it's passed not during session, but at the end of session, to either sign the bill, veto the whole bill, or veto specific lines in the bill. During that time, they're also setting forth, starting up, putting things into play. And you may think that when you pass a state budget, that is the budget. But it actually isn't, and we'll take a little look at what is included truly in the state budget in a minute. State agencies implement what you do. There is actually a large ledger, and those appropriations are entered into a ledger, and the agencies begin executing your appropriations as directed by law. During that time, the House, Senate, the Office of Economic and Demographic Research, which is that joint entity for the House and Senate, start preparation of the long-range financial outlook. That long-range financial outlook sets forth the 3-year forecast for the next 3 years of what our fiscal situation looks like. What are the revenues we expect to have? What are the major expenditures and the typical expenditures that we would make to see whether we're going to be in a shortfall situation or in a surplus situation. And the $7.5 million that Chair Trujillo spoke of is where the first projection for the upcoming year is $7.5 million of surplus, which, as he said, is pretty much nothing in an $82.3 billion budget, which is where we are. When we look at the second year of the forecast, we would look and say, if the legislature did everything as it is forecasted to do, with knowing the revenues coming into play, knowing the expenditures that one would expect would be made, we'd be looking at a $1.3 billion shortfall. In the ensuing year, it would be a $1.8 billion shortfall. So clearly we are in a situation where, since we have to have a balanced budget, there will need to be some adjustments along some lines in order to balance. As the long-range financial outlook is issued, staff are also working on preparing the base budget for the next cycle. And in preparing the base budget, you may have heard that term, all that is doing is taking the recurring appropriations that you all did from the prior year and eliminating the non-recurring funding that you provided because it was only for that 1 year, adding annualizations, adding some other technical adjustments, and that is the base moving forward. So for our $82 billion budget that is currently being enacted for fiscal year 16-17, the base moving forward for the ensuing year is around $70 billion. I think it's $69.5 billion. Remember, that says, ooh, we've got a lot of room. But when you think about it, all of almost a $10 billion DOT work program is all non-recurring, and by law, that whole work program is, they have to request it. The legislature tends to appropriate all of that. So you would see that that base is actually getting, once you add that work program back in there, you're pretty much where we are now, save a couple of billion. Agencies submit their budget requests. Chapter 216 requires that agencies submit their budget requests and provide their statement of need. And those agency budget requests are useful to us because it tells us things that are going on out there where the rubber is hitting the road that we may not know about. We might not know about some of the conditions that they're facing or certain events that have happened. But it is also important to keep in mind that when agencies make a budget request, they do so without constraint or consideration of available revenues. So it has happened on occasion that what one might consider need, another might consider a want. So those need to be taken with that understanding that they're asking, they're stating their needs, but they are not constrained by revenues. Those agency budget requests are due on October 15th of every year. And then 30 days before the onset of the regular session, the governor's recommended budget is due. Now, the governor's recommended budget does have to be balanced within the revenues that he or she believes will be available. And that's somewhat key because I will cite one example in the past. I won't name the governor, but some of you may remember. There was a governor's budget that assumed that there would be almost $1 billion in additional revenues because of new lottery games. That assumption was not necessarily a consensus estimate, which we'll talk about, but he was able to present his budget and say, this is my balanced budget. And that's okay, because you all can look at that and evaluate, is that real or is that not real, and what do you want to do with it? You are not bound by the governor's budget in any way, shape, or form. However, we all keep in mind that he's the chief executive and he has that handy veto pen. While all these things are going on, all year round, the budget, once you pass it, is not static. There are amendments that occur all year round, and there are various different types of amendments. This state budgets at a very, very, at a fair level of minutia, which provides you control. So it is reasonable to expect that there are unforeseen circumstances, or there may be that maybe we didn't exactly get a need right because things fluctuate, and so there are various types of budget amendments that occur all year round. You will see notifications in your email, and you probably see them, they say BAPS Administrator. That means it's a budget amendment. And budget amendments essentially, although there are various types, they come in three sort of levels. A notification, where the state agency, they're making a very small movement, they're simply notifying you of the change. The legislature can object if they feel it's outside of legislative intent, but these are very small changes. The next level is a 14-day consultation, where after a period of 14 days, if both chambers do not formally object to the amendment, then the amendment goes through. And the last is LBC amendments. LBC amendments are large, significant changes, usually over $1 million, usually fairly impactful. And in those instances, either House or the Senate could object, and it would stop the amendment. So that cycle is occurring while this process continues as well.
Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Representative Stone.
Quick question. Since this is a continuous cycle and you call it an annual cycle, have we ever looked at maybe doing a 2-year budget cycle in some states?
I think there was a recommendation for a 2-year budget. We would look at our state constitution and say that because it requires an annual state budgeting process, we have interpreted that as an annual requirement for a budget. We would also note that there are so many changes that occur during a year. An LBC will note that LBC meetings are required just to keep up with some of the unexpected changes in the forces external to the legislature. We've not really explored that too fully.
Yes, sir.
Explain a little bit about the LBC process, how formal that is, and how that actually comes about.
Yes. The LBC is a constitutional body of 14 members, 7 from the Senate, 7 from the House. It is the only constitutional entity that is authorized to meet by telephone if it needs to, because it contemplated that it would need to meet outside of session. Those, it has certain constitutional responsibilities, passing the long-range financial outlook, processing budget amendments, and a few others. When an amendment comes before the LBC, an agency will set that amendment to the governor, or the Justice of the Supreme Court can also submit a budget amendment. The governor has to approve the agency's amendment for it to move forward. Once it moves forward, it is put before the LBC. The LBC, in order for the amendment to pass, a majority of each side plus one has to approve the amendment in order for it to pass. And so it is, it's a fairly tough standard. And did I answer your question?
Is that a fairly routine occurrence that an agency would be looking for an amendment or whatever the number is?
Yes, you have certainly circumstances where you may get a new or enhanced federal grant, and that is an increase in authorization. You may have litigation that is costing more than was anticipated, and they have trust fund authority. One thing the LBC cannot do, however, is increase appropriations for general revenue. They can add trust fund authority, and they can move funds around within an agency, but they cannot cross agencies, and they cannot add general revenue. So there's, even within the broader authority that an LBC has, it cannot do that. Another thing that the LBC does, and I'll get you in a minute, Representative Harrell, is they are able to, sometimes when you all budget, you are not sure if you're doing something new, exactly how this will go. And so what you might do is say, you know what, I'm going to budget this in what's called a qualified expenditure category. And that means I'm going to put a block of money out there, and in order for the agency to get it out, they need to come up with a plan and come before the LBC, and then the LBC will release it. So we do a lot of that stuff as well. Representative Harrell, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. And I'd like you to address, especially for newer members, on trust funds and trust fund sweeps. And trust funds, how much, sometimes perhaps there's trust funds that have not been fully expended, and things that don't necessarily appear.
Okay. What Representative Harrell is talking about, and I'll just sort of move to a different slide. When you look at the state budget, it's comprised of three funding types, so to speak. The General Revenue Fund, which is one fund type. State trust funds, which is another, comprise 290, we budgeted 290 different trust funds this year. And federal trust funds, I'm sorry, that 290 is actually minus 88 federal trust funds that were appropriated. And sometimes a fund and a trust fund, you are under no obligation to appropriate all of those funds. And oftentimes, an agency says it has no need for you to appropriate all of those funds. Sometimes a legislature may say that that trust fund here, we may want to use it for another purpose. Remember that a trust fund, a federal trust fund, is pretty inflexible. They usually come with rules from the feds, so those are hard to access. State trust funds are created by state law and set aside a particular revenue for a particular purpose. However, there are times each legislature is not bound by its predecessors. So when a trust fund, if they say, okay, well, we're not going to use of this $100 million, we're appropriating 80 of it, and we would like to sweep or transfer 10 million to another fund, let's say my favorite fund, the General Revenue Fund, they could do two things. They would change the law about that trust fund for 1 year. That's typically done in the implementing bill, where they would say, notwithstanding laws to the contrary, the purpose of the trust fund or trust funds may change. And then in the back of the General Appropriations Act, usually around Section 52, there will be a list of all those trust fund sweeps. Did I answer your question? Sir?
Can you tell us what may have caused the
Well, and I think we are having a decent recovery from the recession, and we don't really foresee a revenue issue. What we have seen is probably a faster pace of recurring expenditures that, if not curtailed in the future, would outpace your revenue stream. The largest contributor to that is growth in the Medicaid program. And again, these are estimates or forecasts as best we can, but we would look and say it's about recurring expenditures because we are seeing growth. We are seeing a nice recovery in general revenue.
So if you're proposing a tax cut of some kind this year as well, would that affect the, thinking that might affect the budget?
It absolutely affects the budget. So a tax cut is a decrease in revenues. So if you propose 500 million or $1 billion tax cut, that means we will have to cut, we're cutting our revenues by that amount, we will have to cut our expenditures by the same, if not a greater amount. So just keep that in mind as tax cuts are proposed. The money has to come from somewhere, and we have to lower our expenditures in order to pass a balanced budget. So.
Okay, so we've gone through the sad circle that is my life. Again, when you leave and you've passed the General Appropriations Act, you believe that that is the budget, but actually there are adjustments that are made to create that operating budget that we move forward with. And this is a basic little formula. It is that conference report on the GAA, then of course the vetoes have to be deducted, then supplemental appropriations from bills that passed with appropriations are moved into the ledger, into that operating budget, and failed contingencies in the budget are also removed. And a failed contingency, we may budget something that says contingent on the passage of House Bill 81, $2 million is appropriated for the new program, perhaps, that House Bill 81 created. So if that bill did not pass, those funds are removed. There are also adjustments, distributions that are usually redistributions within the budget for administered funds, which are typically issues addressing state employee pay and benefits, and there are other technical distributions. I tell you this because sometimes on the day the budget passes, we issue to you all a number. The budget is X many dollars. And then you might see a month later or 6 weeks later that you get a different pie chart. And the budget isn't that same number. And even later, the budget looks a little different again. And this is why. As this process is done, this is executed by the governor's office with sign-off from the House and Senate, those budget numbers will change while the budget is getting implemented prior to July 1 so that all those pieces and parts fit together. So in actuality, this year it's roughly identical, but some years, if there are large bills that pass with appropriations, you could see some wide variance in the budget. Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Dr. Bigman.
Two dumb questions. Could you explain to me what's meant by failed contingencies? And then please explain this thing as to the district to the back of the
bill, okay. Okay, we'll go with back of the bill first. The back of the bill, in the first 7 sections of the bill are laid out in the Constitution of what they will be. So the first 2 sections are related to education. The third, Health and Human Services. The fourth, criminal justice. The fifth, and you go through, the 7th is judiciary. All of those sections are budgeting for the upcoming year with new dollars. Those are the new dollar, or the dollars, the total dollars that we're moving forward for 17, 18, for example. Section 8 starts the back of the bill. Section 8 relates to proviso or any additional descriptions regarding state employee pay. So if there's a raise, you'll see that raise described, or if there's a a change in the rates for the state employee health insurance trust fund. Those will all be in Section 8. The remaining sections of the bill typically and most often are doing ancillary things other than budgeting for that new year. Most of them are, or a lot of them, are stating we're going to take care of something in the current year. So for example, the most common example would be Medicaid, where it's an entitlement program, so it has to be funded. If we budgeted, right now, let's say we budgeted, $25 billion for Medicaid, and we find that we're going to be short for the 16-17 year, what may happen is in the 17-18 budget, in the back of the bill, because it's not really for 17-18, we will say for the 16-17 budget, we're going to appropriate $300 million to make up that deficit. Also in the back of the bill are reappropriations, and those are dollars that were appropriated once, let's say for springs restoration or for beaches. And they can either be, they can say, well, we did an appropriation for beaches. All those funds weren't used because the projects costed less than we thought, or some of them couldn't get started for some reason. So we're going to take back that appropriation and we may use it for something else. Sometimes you would reappropriate for the same thing that you just appropriated for. It just didn't get done in time for the expiration of the fiscal year. So you may have to say, a fund that we gave in 16-17, we're going to reappropriate that fund for the very same year. We also do those transfers of trust funds that Representative Harrell was talking about, and transfers to the budget stabilization funds. So miscellaneous things that are not really budgeting for that 16-17 year with a new dollar. Failed contingency is an item in the budget that was contingent upon the passage of a bill. If the bill fails, it is a failed contingency, and that money goes away.
Senator Fitzhagen.
When the governor makes a veto, what happens to those funds? Do they go back into general revenue, or do they go back into reserves?
I love the idea of it going into general revenue, but no, the funds actually go back to the fund from whence they came. So if the veto is to the State Transportation Trust Fund, which is unlikely, but it would go back to the State Transportation Trust Fund. If it was a veto of general revenue, it would go back into general revenue. However, it goes into the fund, but it is not and cannot be appropriated until you all decide to appropriate it. So think of funds, whether it's GR or trust funds, like a bank account. And that bank account has monies in it. What you do is authorize the spending of that money. So if there's a veto, you authorize the spending out of general revenue for the Save the Children Fund. That gets vetoed. That money goes back into general revenue, but so the authorization is gone, the money is back, and it cannot be appropriated until you return to appropriate it.
So it sits there and
Correct. Gains interest.
So in that case where it goes back in, would that be a situation where we could use that money in the back of the bill, or would it then go into the earlier, those first silos that you talked about? In a veto situation, let's take general revenue, for example. It's back in general revenue. Could that money then be used by us to reappropriate in the back of the bill, since we already authorized it one time?
Since it was vetoed, it's as if it was never budgeted. So it's not really a reappropriation because the appropriation was never enacted. It never became law. So it just goes into the big blob of general revenue. It no longer is associated with anything. It loses its identity.
And I just have one other, in your circle of life, the agencies that submit their budgets oftentimes look different from what we get from the governor.
Yes.
So do you and your staff look at the differences between those budgets so that we can try to flag things that may be important to an agency but may be less important to the governor?
Absolutely, and each appropriation subcommittee, when they start working on budgets, often depending on the preferences of the chairman, may show this was in the LBR, this was in the governor's recs, and this is what we're working on here in the House. Sometimes through passage of time or depending on the chairman's preference, they may look simply at the governor's rec. But yes, we would evaluate those agency budgets, and those are available to you as well. They're public documents, and they're certainly out there, and we have information on them if you would like that. We're happy to run reports or give you things about the agency's budgets.
Representative Lee, you had a question?
Go back to the question about financial bad. If it goes with, we're not going to
It's a great question, sir. Yeah, reserves, when we think about reserves, reserves are simply funds that are not appropriated. So yes, when there's a veto, it has, and it's a general revenue veto, it has the effect of increasing your reserves. You know, folks sometimes use the nomenclature of saying, how much reserves did we budget? Well, the real answer to that is none. It's what, a reserve is what we don't budget. So for example, when you left, you intentionally wanted to hold back $1 billion in reserves of general revenue. But there were vetoes, and actually revenues came in a little, there was a change in revenues a little higher than expected. And so really what's sitting in reserve in general revenue is actually 1.4 billion. And part of that additional money is the vetoes that you speak of. I'm sorry?
Failed contingencies.
Yes, failed contingencies would also go there.
Representative Fitzenhagen?
This might be a question for you, moving back to trust funds on a policy basis. Can you explain a little bit, because I know I get a lot of pushback from folks about use of how to use the trust funds and what the decision-making process is to sometimes allocate those funds in a manner that wasn't necessarily designed in the trust fund?
So I think that's a great question. So trust funds, they're created by statute. Previous legislatures can't bind future ones. So it's a policy decision for us. If we feel a trust fund is no longer necessary or not accomplishing the goal that it was set out to accomplish, it's incumbent on us to change it. And the reality is when you start looking, I was talking to Joanne about this, we have 289 trust funds. At what point are we just losing all autonomy to these little silos that we've created? Our goal is to pass a balanced budget. That's the only constitutional mandate we have. As we create more and more little trust funds, they're carve-outs for particular industries. And maybe in 1988, the biggest threat facing the state was reflected in those trust funds. Maybe in 2018, it's not. So I think it's incumbent upon us to review those trust funds and start making decisions on, are they necessary? Why were they created? And is this trust fund a bigger priority than funding the alternative, whatever that alternative may be? So we're going to review a lot of them, and the advocacy groups for those trust funds obviously fight hard because it's a dedicated revenue stream to their particular industry, but we're the policymakers. So it's our policy of whether this trust fund is much more important to fulfilling our goal, our commitment to the state of Florida than whatever the alternative may be. Representative Harrell.
Along those same lines, let's talk a little bit about base budget. And we have reoccurring dollars that are sucked out into the base budget. And, we kind of start with that. Are we, especially in a year where things are very tight, are we going to take any opportunity to look down within the base budget and see what those reoccurring dollars are and say, there are so many programs that are started along the way. As you say, in 1988, that may have been somebody's pet project that then got into reoccurring dollars. And are we at some point really going to start looking and do some zero-based budget and go down into those many, many things that are within that base budget?
We definitely will, but that's a job that's for everybody. To just look and say, at Joanne or at the staff or at me or some of the subcommittee chairman, it's too big of a task. So I think it's incumbent upon all the members who sit on those committees to really start dissecting those budgets and start looking at some of the recurring money and start looking at some of the agency money and start looking at some of the expenditures and making decisions, is this really in the state's best interest? Or in the tight budget years, could we use this money for something else? So recurring, non-recurring, agency, everything will be scrutinized. And it's up to us to find areas in which we could spend money either more efficiently or areas where we shouldn't spend money at all. But that is a very, very big task. You're looking at an $83 billion budget. You have all the state agencies, and then all the way you drive down those, and you have all these recurring projects, and then you have all the state universities, and then you have all the state colleges, then you have the court system, and you keep looking at all these universes in 60 or 90 or 120 or 150 days. 2 or 4 or 10 or 15 people can't do it. But a group of 120 plus the staff, I think we could really make a dent on it. Representative Renner, and we'll work our way back through.
Talk about the time person accounts, I mean, there's Amendment 1, which mandates that we spend certain monies on natural resources, which I possibly can't touch. What different kinds of trust funds exist? Is it just the two kinds, one constitutional and one statutory, would wipe them away? And what's the difference in terms of that pie chart? How much of it's constitutional trust funds, and how much of it is are those trust funds that we can get rid of if we want?
So I think there's only one constitutional, the Florida Forever, right? The Amendment 1.
We've got the Amendment 1. We've got some trust funds that are established in the Constitution, like the State Transportation Trust Fund, the Public Education Capital Outlay Trust Fund. So we've got a few, but so they have limitations on what they can be spent on. The Amendment 1 trust fund is fairly unique in that it specifies that it cannot be transferred to general revenue. The Public Education Capital Outlay Trust Fund can only be spent on capital outlay. You cannot change the purpose of that trust fund. But most of the trust funds that are not federal, the federal trust funds, if you change the purpose of it, it's not in state law, and if you try to change the purpose, the deal with the feds is going to be broken, and they'll say, well, you're not going to get the funds to use for this other purpose. But the vast majority of them are in that yellow box there. The vast majority of that $23.9 billion are trust funds where you control the ultimate purpose, either through implementing legislation, conforming legislation, trust fund legislation, and the GAA as to how you ultimately want to spend that.
Follow up on that.
Go ahead.
Same topic. So are we constitutionally obligated to fund those funds or not?
Referring to which one?
To the constitutional funds that you mentioned, such as the education. I think the Florida Forever Fund, we are constitutionally obligated to fund it because there are dock stamp monies that are going to go there each year. But to the other funds that you discussed that are constitutionally mandated, are we, the legislator, required to put money into it each year?
No, and I would think in reading the Amendment 1 constitutional amendment, it says the trust fund has to be used for specific purposes, and it lays out those purposes. It also says you can't commingle it with general revenue. But it doesn't say, nothing anywhere that I'm aware of forces you to appropriate anything. The only exception, and it's not even related, and that is the debt service that the state owes. Though I guess you could technically not do
Default.
it. You would defease your bonds. That would probably be a big problem. But even those constitutional trust funds do not require you to appropriate.
Representative Jacobs and then Representative Altman.
So there are fees that we collect, and they are collected at some point in time for a specific purpose, for which many of them are no longer being used, but the fees are being used for other things. So I think police tire, last year's budget was collected in one case, a fee when they buy a tire, and not a penny of that into the tire, like anything associated with fixed tires. So there are so many claims on those dollars, and in fact, in the budget, there's language that says it
I think it gets tackled through the final product. And what are the state's priorities? We have a lot of priorities. We can't kid ourselves, but some just happen to rank higher than others. And when you look at, especially in this year, when you have no money, waste hire fees or funding corrections, that's a policy decision. That really is a policy decision. It's, at the end of it, the sum has to either be positive or equal zero. So when you start looking at this, and then I think the bigger philosophical question for legislatures in the past and going towards the future, are we going to govern that way? Are we going to govern that tomorrow Representative Broder has this great project, he's going to create a trust fund, and in all perpetuity, that money's going to be protected, regardless of who comes after him? And what are the changes in leadership, and what are the changes in politics and dynamics and priorities in the state? I don't think we should govern that way. I think you're elected, you're accountable, you're responsible to your constituency. And if your constituency wants waste hires and that's your number one issue, you should fight for it. If your constituency wants something else, you should fight for it. But binding future people on past policy decisions, I think it's very short-sighted.
Follow up. My question is not so much that issue, rather than we are collecting a fee for which we clearly are not needing. We're not going to use it. We're using it for other purposes that we have found value in. So the question is, why are we still collecting?
And that's a great point. I think a lot of these trust funds, why are we collecting the fees? And if the trust funds are generating such surplus, why don't we lower the fee? If you're taxing people and you have all this extra money, rather than sweep it and take it back, we should just say, rather than charging them 50 cents, let's charge them 25. Rather than charging them $1, charge them 50 cents. And these are all things that have to be reviewed. And the reality is, do we even need to tax them in the first place?
Well, that's what I'm questioning, is where is that policy coming from? Is that in the committee? Is it the budgeting level? Where is that?
So those policy conversations take place in Ways and Means. They take place at the budgeting, and they take place with the individual members. You could look at all those trust funds and literally analyze and say, if the revenues are 5 and the expenditures are 1, and it's been like that for 10 years, we're overtaxing these people. There's stability in the fund, there's a surplus in the fund, and we should either move some of the money out and put it in another priority, or at a minimum lower the tax so we don't continue generating a surplus on these particular funds. But any single member could review these trust funds and make those determinations and present them to the body.
Representative Jacobs, when I know you sat on AGA groups last year, in that basic budget document that is usually done in some of the first few weeks, there should be included in that a listing of all the trust funds, their purposes, their authorizing statutes, their recent cash balances in the fund, and their recent appropriation. So there is an effort to try to compile that and provide that to the membership. And there has been discussion about reducing, that becomes a call within the legislature of whether or not to do that. But we try and we will continue to make that information available to everyone.
Representative Altman?
I'd like to hear a little bit about the allocation process. That's something that has a huge impact. You said on the criminal justice or education, but yet you have no vote, no choice on the allocation, which moves around billions of dollars. And that is something that the general body doesn't have enough to vote for. That's done elsewhere prior to us even getting a bite of the apple. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that process, how transparent it is. Are we doing anything to make it more transparent so members can get more of a voice in the allocation?
Go ahead.
By rule, and I think some of this is for Chair Trujillo, but by rule, the allocation is under the authority of the Speaker, and so that is part of the House rules. And each Speaker has done that in their own way. From a staff perspective and an information perspective, I have never worked with a speaker or a chairman who has not very closely evaluated, the chairman most specifically, all the relevant needs of the particular subcommittee and making them, and other priorities in making those determinations. But that is up to the discretion of every new speaker how to operate the allocation process, and it has differed from administration to administration.
And I think from the transparency aspect, in our House rules that we all voted for, Members having to own their projects, and those projects being published, and those projects being debated, and those projects being open, it ends the allocation games. Because the real allocation games, at least a lot of the ones we've seen in the past, is all this hidden money that all of a sudden appears on the last day, and it's all these projects that you've never heard of being funded. That's no longer the case, because every single person's held accountable. And when that project's funded, we all look at each other and we could say, where was it filed? How much was it filed for? And who's the person who filed it? It's not this mystery of, 50 or 100 or 200 or $300 million just popping up in the back of the budget or popping up on the last day during those 72 hours we're reviewing the budget. So the transparency of having to file this, having to debate it, having to have the discourse, makes it a lot more transparent and it makes it a lot more fair. Projects will no longer survive or die based on leadership or based on who's in power. They'll be judged and vetted based on their merit. Representative Richardson.
Thank you. So I'm just trying to figure out the mechanics on this. Under the new rules, the allocation for the speaker or for the chair. So are you saying going forward, there's not gonna be a withhold? And if not, how do we get through conference if the Senate is taking a different approach?
I'm having difficulty. What do you mean by a withhold?
So a withhold, let's say that, the budget is 83 billion, but the speaker decides to allocate 82 or 82.5 and withholds 500 million, like we saw the last cycle. If you remember, this 100 million showed up in the budget the last day, right? So that was a withhold that allowed that cushion. So are you saying going forward, we're not going to have a withhold? And if so, how do we get through conference?
No, I would say the withhold's going to exist, but the projects that are funded with that 100 million are going to be open and transparent.
And Rep. Richardson, part of, again, every new administration will do things a little differently. Some folks have come to think of this as a project pot, or it's often referred to as a bill pot. And when, there are two allocation periods, one prior to the House budget being prepared and one during conference. Recognizing that there are issues that may arise, you haven't passed all your bills yet, and there are bills that are going to require appropriations. There may be difficulties where the allocation that is given to a subcommittee, it's just not working out, and you gotta find a way to smooth that. So although those monies have in recent years been used to purchase a lot of projects, part of the withhold is done just out of a cautiousness to ensure that you can smooth over any bumps and get through some unexpected issues. So it serves a variety of purposes. And again, each administration may hold back, very vastly differing amounts depending on the conditions that are at hand, including available revenues.
So just to follow up if I can, so under that scenario, it seems to me that a member could have a bill that's submitted that doesn't get funded on the first cycle, but could possibly get funded as part of the withhold later down the road. Is that right?
As long as it goes through the House process, yes.
Or it could be in the allocation, things change. It could get, something else could fall out and something else comes in, and without the
Representative Altman.
I want to bring up that I heard talk about. Now, the legal restrictions on recurring and non-recurring funds. I'd love to hear more about that process. If you propose a project or you have a bill that may affect recurring or non-recurring, we do have restrictions on how we spend recurring funds.
Generally, there's a constitutional restriction on the use of recurring funds, or are you talking about the projects?
The Constitution.
Okay. The constitutional restriction is that you cannot spend more than 3%. You can't exceed your recurring revenue by more than 3% of recurring appropriation. So think of it this way. We have revenues coming into the state. Those revenues come in as non-recurring revenues that we're going to get them just once, a settlement perhaps, or recurring revenues, an increase in sales tax, which is You also have appropriations. When you appropriate, you're giving authority to spend. It is possible, and the legislature has appropriated more in recurring than it had the revenue to do. And the Constitution says you can only do that up to 3% of your expected or estimated revenues. And that is to curtail the notion of appropriating funds that aren't going to be there. And that was part of recent 2007 or 6 constitutional. So that's the limitation in the Constitution. Typically and lately, you try not to spend any more recurring on than you have recurring revenue, and this is limited to general revenue.
So our projects, do they come out of the current product?
In the future, the House rule would provide that projects would be non-recurring. There is a recurring exception, and we've got a session on that, and we'll have that in tomorrow.
Representative McGee, you had a question?
Yeah, there's a thing out now. So it sounds as if there was an issue, a previous issue where we had stacked of that up to 3%, but amount of revenue, which created what I believe to be a problem with the current contract now. And that's why we probably need to home in and bring in that it should be a current allocation.
I would say that's basically it. If you keep throwing stuff into recurring, and it's not really vetted and it stays in there for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and it just keeps growing. So you have your baseline level of all these things that we throw in, and then the people after us throw it in, and the people after them, and the next thing you know, you have a 100-story building. So our goal is to start chipping it away and saying, let's start from the bottom and start building our way back up. And not even building our way back. Let's start from the bottom, and then every new legislature could appropriate what they need. It's non-recurring, and then the people after them aren't bound by those decisions. They can appropriate what they need. It's non-recurring, and we keep moving forward. Representative Lee? So claims bills are specific to the type. Some are funded by municipalities. Some are funded by special districts. Some are funded by the state general revenue, I believe. So it all depends on who was sued. So a police officer, unfortunately running a red light and injuring somebody, that'll be probably a municipal or a county one. Department of Corrections, it'll be a state one. So it depends, the nexus of who's responsible for that agency will dictate where that money comes from. But regardless, if they are over a certain amount, 250,000 or 500,000, they have to be ratified and approved by the state. So if the school board doesn't have the money to settle the claim, the state's not going to bail them out. So the state's not going to say, you know what, you guys failed to supervise whomever and somebody got injured, so the state's going to pick up this responsibility. We're not. So if it does come to the state and it's not agreed or agreed upon, and we mandate the school board is going to have to make due and pay that debt, or the municipality is going to have to make due and pay that debt. My personal view is you can't victimize the injured party because the person who injured them no longer has the resources to pay them. The person who was injured and was ultimately successful and received that judgment, they're the most sympathetic. The school board not having the money, that's something they need to figure out. Representative Geller?
Yeah, I just want to go back to the point that, I think the issue is not, is the money needed necessarily there? That's one issue. It's not really, to me, the issue is the transparency. If we're raising money that we say, you're paying these extra dock stamps because we have an affordable housing crisis. And that's how we sell the fact that we're collecting that money. And, the reason that they're full trust funds, because we're basically asking people to trust us, that that's what we're going to do. So if you're saying we're making you pay this because we have an affordable housing crisis, then the money in that should only be spent for that purpose. If that is too well funded, and we can argue about what's an optimum
And I think your argument would be have more weight if you had a choice. So you know, you and your wife decide you want to buy a new house. You can't opt out of your doc stamp. You can't just say, you know what, I'm going to opt out of the affordable housing part. I don't want to contribute to that. It's a tax. It's mandatory. So why do we as policymakers pigeonhole ourselves into these little universes of this revenue is going towards this and this revenue is going towards that? We're not required to do it by the Constitution. What we should do is revisit all these trust funds and the ones that aren't federally mandated and the ones that are not constitutionally mandated. Why do they even exist? Are we going to regulate our behavior to the point that every single direct nexus is going to be with the activity that it's associated? So we should spend, if you spend you go to Disney World, that money should only be spent for tourism marketing because it's Disney World. If you go to Miami Beach, that money should only be spent for whatever particular purpose is unique to Miami Beach. That's not the way the state runs. And we have to get out of that mindset and this is stuff that we've been bound by this.
That's the point. We shouldn't tell people you're paying, because you don't have a choice. We shouldn't tell people you're paying dock stamps. It's to fund affordable housing, or you're paying this 50 cents a tire to clean up tires that are, you know, a real.
I'm with you. So
Just charge it where we can and say it's general and not sell it as something that it's not, and we're not going to use it.
I agree with you. And once we do that, we start giving away our power. Our power is to appropriate and to make those policy decisions. Once you start makes people, past legislatures, make those policy decisions for you. And maybe their priorities are not in line with yours. So going forward, I think it's something we should definitely consider. And we have probably time for two more questions for Representative Richardson.
Just a point, and then I think this is a really great conversation because we are misleading people when we tell them we're collecting something for something. But I think what we have to address is oftentimes it's not that we don't need that money because obviously we have found we need it because we're sweeping it. So if we need it and we're sweeping it, then we're going to have to find a way to replace it. And so that has to be part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely, there has to be a need analysis. Is there really a need there? And what is the amount of that need? And is there another way to possibly fund it?
Exactly.
Last question before we wrap up. By now you're all budget gurus. Anything else? Thank you, guys.